I will now offer a brief question and commentary on today's readings. First, I would like to let you know, as you can tell, I've had my jacket returned to me. Secondly, there's a very important issue that's been brought up concerning the role of land, and specifically the concern of land in regards to the coining of money and what it means to have a coined money based upon something like land, as opposed to understanding currency or money as a form of consideration of labor. This is important, I think, at this time when we consider the movements of people that are occurring at this time on the planet. And with the COVID-19 situation we're in, that is one factor. But the movements of people from place to place have been something of significance for a considerable amount of time. I recall at a certain point in time, I was out of the country, and I was alerted to protests that were happening on the other side of the world in Europe. There were people that were in the streets of Greece at the time. There was a very considerable effort being made to bring attention to what were being identified as specific claims around unfair measures. And one of the political ambitions of those that were contesting these measures was the exit from the European Union on a specific set of terms, specifically, as I recall, an understanding that the terms that were being imposed upon the nation were misrepresented and engaged under fraudulent pretenses and attempted to compel the country to participate in a manner that violated their own understanding of national sovereignty. The understanding was the financial arrangements were predicated upon false pretenses, and as a result, it was not acceptable to continue to participate as a member of this compact. And what ended up happening? Well, so far as I know, Greece did not exit the European Union. What did happen was sometime later, there was a consideration of the role that the United Kingdom played in terms of its relationship to that same compact, the European Union. Now, the terms under which it was discussed for the United Kingdom to exit the European Union were considerably different than the ones that were being presented in the protest and by the government at the time of the nation of Greece. Attendant, I understand, with these protests were considerations of changes that had occurred within the European pension system. My understanding is that involved in these changes were considerations of the movements of people that were being created as refugees in other countries and that were seeking to exit those countries where there were wartime situations ongoing and compelling them to leave their homes in one manner or another anyhow, and they were seeking refuge in the European area within the confines of what would be constituted or understood to be the European Union. I watched this for several years after that when I returned to the United States. I specifically watched it throughout the spring and the summer of 2016. In the fall of 2015, there was a very determinate event that occurred in Paris. Perhaps you may remember it yourself. Among the things that were going on, it was understood that there was a large mobilization of interest, and concurrent to that were protests that had been organized by indigenous organizations. But around that time, there apparently was also an alert, some sort of alleged simulation of a police action, and it did occur at that time frame, that there was a terrorist attack that targeted a nightclub, if I'm correct. There was a band playing. I remember hearing the name of the band. It struck a note. This was around the time there was a terrorist attack also in Lebanon, within a very specific time frame, by the way. Shortly after that, there were other terrorist attacks. There were terrorist attacks in Copenhagen. There were terrorist attacks in Brussels. And around the time of these terrorist attacks, one of the things that was available in the United States, at least through the media, as acknowledgement of the context, were that there was, among other things, a conference of law enforcement officials in the European Union that were discussing what to do about the situation regarding migrants. The tone regarding what to do about the migrants was considerably different prior to the attacks on Brussels and Copenhagen than it was afterward. Now, at some point, even after that, I had the chance to read through some of the primary source documents around the changes to the European pension system, specifically an understanding of the imposition of quotas regarding refugees, and how different countries, depending upon different things that were ongoing with the changes that were being imposed or being set up in connection with their own pension systematology, were going to have to provide a different kind of consideration to meeting the needs of the refugees, and that there were certain commitments that were expected of them. This was not explicitly discussed as part of the context for the other concerns that were brought up regarding the British exit from the European Union. But I think they're very relevant now. I'm in a city right now where in the downtown area, I understand they have converted the convention center to be a holding cell for more than 2,000 young men between the ages of 15 and 17. That convention center is a commercial establishment. They have conventions there for commercial aims. You rent out the space to provide an event aimed at commercial interests. I understand how the technology there works. I understand how it can also be turned into a literal clearinghouse. I personally have been in one of those clearinghouses for a protracted period of time. I know how long it takes for a bundle to clear through there. And it didn't even have the kind of density they've created since. And they didn't just do that in Dallas, did they? I watched how they beta tested this on homeless people at two similar convention centers in Houston following Hurricane Harvey. I understood then how the technology worked, after having been subjected to it as a form of testing. See, I've done what I can to develop processes of self-attenuation in isolation, and in regards to other experiences I've had, I have a particular context, but I am 43 years old. In the state of Texas, one is eligible to begin to attempt to acquire a driver's permit when they're 15 and a half years old. But I anticipate that none of these young men are going to be provided with formal instruction in how to drive a motor vehicle, and that they are not going to be provided with their own driver's license. Which brings up questions regarding the very significant changes to the insurance law in Texas that has commenced in the last 20 years and is on the books now. Books which, by the way, are no longer available to the public, presumably because of COVID-19. Who owns the land underneath that center downtown? Is that center itself a fixed asset associated with bonds for the city and municipality of Dallas? What is the value of that land? How much does it cost per day or even per hour to rent out that space? Who's paying for it? In order to rent out that space, there are agreements that would have to be made, a kind of contract. There are terms to that contract, including provision of emergency services and security, as well as an agreement for a certain kind of insurance on whatever the entity is that is responsible for renting out that space. What is going to be the value of each unique product created with the copyright on the information compiled in the personal histories of each of those young men downtown? See, nobody provided me with an inventory of the products they created when I was detained for 10 days in a similar situation in Houston. Nobody provided me with a cost value assessment of the strategically designed rationales that were created while I was under observation. Nobody provided me with the billing records for what was alleged to be medical treatment, up to and including prescription of medication that I refused to ingest. Nobody provided me with any of the information concerning what was alleged to be instruction of students involved in the observation who took notes that they observed in terms of my behavior. Those notes would also include understanding whatever they believed from their professional and developing professional perspective was my actual mental status, while I was insisting the whole time that I needed to speak with mandated reporters of child abuse about having witnessed crime and being denied any access to anybody who was a mandated reporter of child abuse because I was there under fraudulent pretenses. That observation was held in what was alleged to be 2 different hospitals, one public, one private. It was done in lieu of me receiving up to 90 days of room and board while I attended an instruction program in non-destructive testing that presumably was paid for in part by grants provided by the federal government. Now that's a lot to factor into a particular assessment of the value of the money that has not been accounted for just based on that one 10-day event involving one person who happened to be above the age of legal consent, old enough to run for Congress, and if necessary, old enough to run for President of the United States. Unfortunately, because Texas right now is in abrogation of its own law and has been now for more than 3 years, when I try to acquire a driver's license, I have to go and get run through the same database as people that are around the age of those young men downtown. See, they're required by law to have a separate adult driver's database. They just don't do it.